Welcome to our webinar series. Thanks so much for joining us today. I would like to begin by acknowledging that Canberra is Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. I also want to pay my respects and thanks to all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who engaged and campaigned around the referendum, acknowledge a lot of the racism that occurred during that referendum campaign and give them my thanks and love. And I want to acknowledge that Canberra was the only territory who voted yes to the voice to Parliament in the Constitution. And I want to acknowledge that Indigenous communities overwhelmingly voted yes to the voice to Parliament, including 74% of the 11,000 people that live in Lingyari in their remote areas of that electorate. And for a lot of non-Indigenous Australians, the referendum is over, but for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, a lot of the gaps in health outcomes, in education outcomes, and the over-incarceration and over-policing of Aboriginal people still remains, and that work still remains for all of us to do. Days and times do vary for the Australia Institute's webinars, so please head on over to our website at australiainstitute.org.au for all our upcoming webinars and events, including the Revenue Summit coming up in Canberra next week, and lots of other exciting events. Just a couple of tips before we begin today to help things run smoothly. If you hover over the bottom of the screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box where you can ask questions of our panelists. You should also be able to upvote questions from other people. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we will remove you. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and it will be posted on our website. So the latest issue of Australian Foreign Affairs, which I have here in my hot little hands, available in newsagents and good bookstores around the country, examines China's ultimate goals as an emerging superpower, including the extent of its territorial ambitions. The new Domino Theory looks at Australia's place in China's long-term plans and at the threat, if any, that Beijing poses to Australian security, politics, and society. So to discuss this in greater depth, I'm delighted to introduce today's panel. Jiang is the Australian Institute of International Affairs China Matters Fellow and a former policy advisor in the Australian government. Dr. Merriden Varrall is a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute, where she was formerly director of the East Asia program. Prior to that, she was a UN diplomat based in Beijing, and she has a PhD in Chinese foreign policy. And my colleague, Dr. Emma Shortis, is a senior researcher with our International and Security Affairs program at the Australia Institute, as well as an historian and writer focused on the history and politics of the United States and its role in the world. So we're discussing two of the essays in this issue of Australian Foreign Affairs. Merriden's essay looks at whether the conventional wisdom that underpins China policy is correct in Australia. And Yun's essay analyses Australia's approach to addressing foreign interference and its consequences. So a very timely issue and lots to get stuck into. I will just say thank you again to everyone who's joining us. We had more than 700 people register for today's webinar. So I want to get stuck in with your essay, Yun, the usual suspects. The beginning of your essay kind of takes us back a little bit in time and outlines your experience of being asked by some Australian senators essentially to prove your loyalty to Australia by denouncing the CCP in 2020. I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about that experience and why you think there was such hysteria around foreign interference then.
Thank you. I am also speaking from the land of Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I pay respect to the elders here. So yes, back then, back in 2020, I was asked, while I appeared in the Senate inquiry, I was asked by one of the senators to basically condemn the Chinese Communist Party. At the time, I was very shocked, of course, because no one else was asked the same question. And later on, it was quite obvious that the questions was targeted only at those who were of ethnic Chinese background. So back in the days, so let's take back to maybe 5 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago. How did this hysteria around foreign interference start? Well, from about late 2017, the Australian government started to take measures against foreign interference from China. And in fact, initially at the time, I personally was very supportive of this effort, because at the time I felt that there was not enough understanding of the Chinese system, including, for example, on how the Unite Front system operates in other countries. And I thought, it is good that we're finally getting some understanding of this quite important issue. And China is, of course, a very big country and very important to Australia. So it's good that we're getting more and more understanding of how it operates. But unfortunately, from very early on, the focus was shifted from foreign interference, countering the threats of foreign interference, to what popular media discourse called Chinese influence. And that was also accompanied by a lot of sensationalism in the media at the time, and very, very quickly descended into the scenario of red under the bed, where, you see photos of politicians shaking hands with, say, a Chinese official, and that quickly became some sort of evidence of Chinese influence. And that was also being used as a kind of a political witch hunt. So perhaps I was a bit too naive early on. A lot of other Chinese Australians did point out the danger of this foreign interference called descending down into this kind of a hysteria. And later on, I was also convinced, and my confidence personally in Australia's ability to deal with foreign interference this really dropped as a result. So why did it happen? Well, foreign interference became a useful tool to sledge political opponents, basically. And for people who worked on China, or in foreign policy, or in national security space, or in human rights, I think a lot of people back then were quite relieved that the government is finally paying attention. And so they did not want to stop the momentum of that focus on foreign interference. And there was, of course, a lot of funding initiatives associated with that as well. And the effect of that is that Chinese Australians came under a lot of suspicions, a lot of scrutiny, even though we know that anyone could be influenced by a foreign government. There is a perception, and I think that sometimes still exists nowadays, that Chinese Australians are especially susceptible. And in my essay, I did delve into why that may be the case. So I think as a result, Chinese Australians became, at that time, unacknowledged collateral damage of these countering foreign interference efforts. But I think things have changed a little bit since then. Now, at least there is acknowledgement that Chinese Australians wore the collateral damage. But unfortunately, some damage has already been done. And as a result, it will take time to reverse.
Yeah. We'll definitely come back to some of those issues that you've raised there. But Merriden, I want to come to you next, because I was really struck by your essay, Shaky Ground, and basically kind of pointing out that we have a lot of assertions around what China is doing and how that impacts on our national security, for example. But really, you take a look at what's missing from the current debate around China. So what is missing, and what can your essay tell us about kind of the limits of the debate in Australia as it currently stands?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ebony, and hi panelists, and hi everybody in the audience. Greetings from Gadigal land. What's missing in our debate about China? Well, I think what Yoon was saying just now kind of leads into it, that we have a propensity for taking one particular angle and not exploring the potential other angles and the nuances and the details. And that's something that is, to some degree, a kind of natural shortcutting that we do in the media. It's what we do in policy making. We try to simplify something into something that's understandable so that we can then take action around it. But the thing with China is it's complicated. If there's one thing that we know, that is true. It's that it's complicated. And so anything that simplifies it is bound to miss something important, is bound to miss some important detail. Nobody has all the answers about China. Anybody who says, oh, well, China is obviously trying to do this, and China is clearly trying to achieve that. And you see it, once you become alert to it, you see it everywhere. China is obviously blah, blah, blah hegemony. China is obviously blah, blah, blah influence. And it's the minute you see that, you must think something's not right there. Something's missing. It's not obviously doing anything. Anyone who thinks that China is obvious doesn't have a clue what's actually going on. So what's missing from our debate in Australia, and I'd argue that this is true for the debate in the US and in a lot of other English-speaking or Western countries, is nuance, is understanding all of the complexities. And when Yun was talking a minute ago about sort of five years ago, what we came to in Australia was a moment where even acknowledging the possibility that there was nuance or another side to the story or another angle became tantamount to almost treason. So to say, well, hang on, let's look at that from the Chinese point of view. What would that mean if we thought about it from the Chinese perspective? Was immediately tantamount to not being sufficiently loyal to Australia. And there was a lot of media, there were books published about, people who dared to even consider that China might be looking at this from another angle. And I found in my own work that I had to spend a lot of time introducing and precursing everything that I said with, I'm not saying that the Chinese perspective is right. I'm not saying that I agree or to acquiesce. I'm just saying that it's something we shouldn't think about. It's something we should accept. But it's been really removed from our discussions. And whether it's right or wrong is immaterial. But those Chinese perceptions of the world, how it fits into the world, how it sees itself, how it sees its history, how it sees its goals in the world, how it sees Australia, they're all absolutely critical to understanding why it does what it does, how it reacts, why it reacts in certain ways. And if we don't acknowledge that, whether we like it or not, or agree with it or not, if we don't acknowledge that, we're going to be wrong in what we try to do and how we try to manage or engage or whatever it is we're trying to achieve with China.
Yeah, I thought that was such a good point that you kind of made at the beginning, that we're so often talking about what Australia is doing or what China is doing in its foreign policy, and not often enough, why is China acting in that particular way or doing that particular thing. But Yun, I want to come back to you and the kinds of conversations that we were and are having around foreign interference. What's the difference between foreign interference and foreign influence? If you can just explain that for our viewers at home briefly.
Yeah, very briefly, I'll talk about what difference should be. The difference should be on the method. And according to the legislative definition, the definition of interference is one that is covert, corrupt, or coercive, and doesn't really matter which country is doing it. So even our friends or allies can still use foreign interference against us, according to this definition. So, for example, a hypothetical example, if the, say, United States government is, secretly paying off Australian politicians, or if, for example, a hypothetical example, the Indian government is coercing East diaspora community in Australia, those will all be cases of interference, just like if the Chinese government was doing it. So it's the same. But the focus on a lot of, in politics as well as in media, has instead been shifted to sort of focus on intention. So whether, so in that sense, influence and interference is often conflated. And whether something is problematic, it depends on whether it's perceived as malign or benign. And because it is really difficult to fully understand, someone's intention, it then became dependent on whether we like the country or not. So, we trust them. We don't trust China. We didn't like China. So anything China did in terms of influencing what's happening in Australia or the Australian political system became seen as a problem, as sort of interference. Whereas if we like a country, then whatever they're doing was not a problem. And at that extreme, even things you think is very normal things like arts and cultural exchanges became framed as a sort of an influencing attempt, according to certain media outlets. And what happened was, if you have, for example, if we had a webinar like this and you invite US government officials to talk about US government views, that's quite non-controversial. But as soon as if you invited Chinese government officials, you're very much open yourself to criticism of supporting Chinese propaganda, even though, those, in both cases, they're government officials representing the government perspective. And that could actually create a vicious cycle where any forms of exchange or engagement with China became seen as influencing attempt. And naturally, people then people stopped doing those exchanges and engagements. And of course, because of that, it then becomes very hard to change the nature of this adversarial relationship. But I think now there is acknowledgement since the new government that this has been a problem and has been an overreaction. And I think has rolled back slightly. But as Merriden was saying before, but now people are just so used to thinking about this that you have to preface everything just to make sure that you don't get misattributed, misquoted. So I think this kind of fear does take a while to disappear.
Yeah. Emma, I wonder if I can come to you next. That kind of hysteria that Yun is talking about and that Merriden kind of cited, where, there's so much that has to be done before you can even get to the substantive issues to kind of establish, the why you're talking on a subject and that you're not subject to any foreign interference. How much has that kind of hysteria infected other parts of how Australia is kind of pursuing things like the AUKUS arrangement and the discussions that happened around that? Is this kind of thing that we've seen with the foreign interference infecting other elements of national security and foreign affairs?
Thanks, Eb. It's a really good question and I think a really important one. And I suppose I'd start by saying that I'm coming to you from Gunditjmara country in southwestern Victoria, and really commend your comments about the voice referendum and note that the arguments that Yun and Merriden are making are deeply connected to that racism. The kind of racial profiling that Chinese Australians experience is deeply connected to the voice referendum result and the way that this country behaves in the world. And that has absolutely created a kind of hysteria that's not isolated to talking about China, but is something that kind of trickles through to all of our conversations about foreign policy, and particularly about AUKUS. Merriden is so right that, whenever you're talking about not just China, but foreign policy in Australia, you have to do, especially as a woman, you have to do so much hedging in order to be taken seriously. And you have to do so much work to point out that explanation is not justification. And by the time you've done all that hedging, you kind of can't get to that complexity that Merriden and Yun are talking about. And we saw that absolutely in the adoption of AUKUS and the way that we can talk about the so-called China threat or even what AUKUS is about. So much complexity just gets papered over when we talk about what AUKUS is even for. We can't, or often you'll see kind of feeble attempts to say that AUKUS isn't actually about China. That's not the primary motivation. But of course we know that it is. And so we end up in this ridiculous situation where we're dramatically oversimplifying the complexities of the international arena and also making decisions while doing the same thing, while erasing that complexity. And I think it's so interesting in this edition of Foreign Affairs, the way that Margaret Simon's essay about AUKUS is sat between Merriden and Yun's essay, because as Simon's kind of goes through the decision-making, particularly in the Labor Party around AUKUS, it's very interesting to see who was influencing those decisions. And they mostly have something in common, which I'll kind of leave readers to parse. But that's why I think this panel is so exciting, and this edition of Foreign Affairs is so exciting, because it's an indication, I think, that is slowly starting to change, and we are starting to acknowledge the hysteria and what it's based on, and really start to interrogate the assumptions behind it.
Merriden, if I can come back to you, your essay looks at how China views the world and what China's viewpoint is, looking at the evidence that we do have, and also how China views Australia. So I just wondered if you could take us through a few of those observations based on evidence. For example, I'm thinking here of people who might not be familiar with the 2-century goals, for example, and what that tells us about how China sees the world. And then also if you could tell us about how China sees Australia.
Yes, I'd love to. So we were thinking about, so you referred to the 2 centenary goals, Ebony, and what I tried to do in the essay was just look at some examples of Chinese policy, Chinese very clearly stated intentions, not for an external audience, but in their own 5-year plans, in their own planning, to see what can that tell us about how China sees the world, what it wants to achieve, and that kind of internal language and that internal goal setting. Because foreign policy is a reflection of domestic policy. So what a country does externally is because of something it's trying to achieve internally. It's a means to an internal end. So everything that Australia, the US, France, anybody, China does externally is because they're trying to achieve something internally. So what is it? And things like the 2 centenary goals, those are 2 very, very important political and policy purposes that are about recognising the establishment of the Communist Party, and 100 years since then, what has the Communist Party done to show that it has made China a better place for Chinese people to live. And the other one is establishing the new China in 1949, when the Communist Party was victorious over the Nationalist Party in the Civil War. What has happened since then? So when the Chinese government measures its successes, what does success look like? It's really very much about improving the livelihoods of Chinese people within the mainland. It has 3 core interests or core goals. One is, I'm thinking about here what Chinese Communist Party legitimacy is based on. And it has 3 pillars there. One of them is the ongoing well-being of the Chinese people. People have to feel that they're better off than their parents were and that their grandparents were. The second is that people have to feel that the country is getting better, that the country is resuming, and we can come to that in a minute when we talk about, its worldviews, but resuming its role, its rightful, what they see as its rightful role in the world. And the third is the ongoing sort of the ongoing strength of the party. And if any of those things are not being achieved, then the Chinese people, this is the kind of state social contract, then the Chinese people have a sense that they have a right to be unhappy and to cause some unrest. So with those centenary goals and other policy goals the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government put forward reflect this sense of how China sees itself in the world, what it wants to achieve domestically. And I think the key thing here that we should really understand, and I try to call this out in the essay, is this idea of the century of humiliation. And it's something that's so visceral in many Chinese mainlanders, I'd say most, if not all Chinese mainlanders, because it's so deeply inculcated and socialized in the education system, within the social and cultural surroundings. It's very deliberately constructed and maintained idea. And the idea is that China was a grand and legitimate and respected global actor. It was large and it was important. And I'm really carefully not using the word powerful here because of the implications that we automatically ascribe to that word and what power means. I'm leaving that word out on purpose, but grand and respected and legitimate. And then, according to this narrative, in the 1800s, a group of allied powers, Japan, France, Germany, England, and the US, decided to break into China, because China didn't want to have anything to do with the outside world, break into China, pull it apart, weaken it, and every weakness and every vulnerability that China has suffered since then, according to this narrative, is because Western countries deliberately pulled it apart and made it weak. And so this idea of national humiliation, of 100 years of bullying and victimization, is really, really central to how China understands itself and its place in the world. And it's combined with a couple of other things, one of which is that cultural characteristics are unchanging. And so according to this story, China has always been peaceful and therefore will always be peaceful. And again, please remember what I was saying before about whether or not this is true, whether or not this is right. It's an explanation, not a justification, as Emma said. Okay, so China's always been peaceful. And the other side of that is that countries like America have always been hegemonic, colonial, interfering, and therefore will always be behaving in that way. So what we've got is this kind of worldview where China was harassed and persecuted by these actors by just trying to keep it weak, bring it down, encircle it. And that's just what is happening today. So China sees itself as absolutely under attack all the time by these external powers. And it understands that the world's primary purpose is trying to keep it weak and prevent it from resuming what it sees as its rightful place in the world. So Xi Jinping's language, President Xi Jinping's language, is all about rejuvenation, the China dream of rejuvenation, going back to how it was before when China was a legitimate, grand actor in the world. And the third component of this is that history is inevitable. So whatever happens, whatever irritating things that America does to try and stop it and keep it down and keep it weak, we will go back to how it's meant to be. So we can wait. You often hear people talk about China playing the long game. We can wait. Things will go back to how they're meant to be because that's how they're meant to be. In due course, things will go back. And Taiwan is part of that story. We hear a lot of talk about, is China going to invade Taiwan? When is it going to happen? What, is it going to be this year? Is it going to be in 5 years? Is it going to be in 10 years? Is it Xi Jinping's legacy? To some extent, it doesn't matter because China understands that it will come back. It's not necessarily in a huge hurry to make that happen. It's just understood that Taiwan needs to come back to the mainland because it's like, a limb that has left. It's a family member that has been pulled apart. Of course, it must come back to where it's naturally supposed to be. So this is how China understands the world. It sees itself as under persecution and under harassment and under victimization by these external actors. It's desperately worried about the risks that the outside world has for it and for Communist Party legitimacy, but it also knows that it needs the world to survive. So it's a really, really difficult conundrum that it finds itself in. So I'll leave it there. Ebony, first I could go on for a lot longer, but I'll stop.
Yeah, no, we might come back to that in some of the questions, I suspect. But Emma, I wanted to come to you next because I feel like Merriden's kind of given a great example there of some of the history of China and why it sees the world the way that it does. But the discourse in Australia is often really focused around this idea of we have to enforce kind of the rules-based order. And I wonder if you could just give us an explanation of what that is and why it's brought up so often in relation to China.
Sure. I think Merriden's comments were getting to this as well, from an angle that we don't often come to them. So the international rules-based order is this kind of idea, it's very Western idea around the construction of an international architecture or international institutions that enforce a predictable and fair rules-based system that benefits the whole world, right? And the Australian government talks about this international rules-based order and the need to maintain the international rules-based order all of the time, as does the United States. And on the face of it, that's there's nothing wrong with suggesting that the world should operate by an agreed set of rules, universal human rights, for example, being one of them. But I think when you sit that alongside Merriden's comments, and I think also Yun's essay and her engagement with ideas around democracy and free speech and that aspect, I suppose, of or that's intrinsic or assumed to be part of the international rules-based order, you get a really interesting result, because when you put those two things alongside each other, you can see, and again, explanation is not justification, but you can see how many in China would see the way that this idea of the international rules-based order is deployed as a reinforcement of exactly those assumptions that Merriden was talking about, that the United States in particular is out to enforce its own hegemony and to enforce a system, the international rules-based order, that disproportionately benefits the United States and is aimed also specifically at containing China and at stopping China from developing in the way that it wants to. And I think there are fairly constant reminders, if that is your mindset, that the international rules-based order is deployed in order to benefit certain countries. And I think, without getting into it, because this is not the place for that discussion, we can see that happening this week, where we see a very selective application of the international rules-based order and its institutions to international affairs by the same Western nations that we are talking about. And so falling into that trap, I think, of reinforcing those perceptions in China means, as both Merriden and Jiang point out in their essays, that we kind of fall into this self-reinforcing spiral where our prophecies around Taiwan or the China threat end up reinforcing each other. And rather than kind of looking for circuit breakers with all these layers of misunderstanding and also racism, we find that we come to, I think, solutions that aren't, or approaches, policy approaches that aren't fit for purpose. And I'm sure we'll come back to this, but if we return to AUKUS, for example, deterrence is another one where this idea of deterrence, a very Western idea kind of embedded in Cold War thinking, is assumed to mean something in the West that it doesn't mean in China. And so we have this constant clash of assumptions and expectations that we find ourselves trapped in today.
Ewan, I wonder if I can come back to you just on a slightly separate point, and noting the campaign that Australia has just been through with the referendum. You talk a bit in your essay about issues around social media and the way governments have sought, both in China and in other countries like Australia, to regulate social media and speech on social media around companies like TikTok and WeChat, and arguably, getting it wrong more often than not. Obviously, we've seen a lot of disinformation throughout the referendum campaign. That's something that I think Australia is going to have to negotiate for future elections and how we manage that. But how is this issue of regulating speech and, disinformation in social media? How have governments in China and Australia responded to that?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So my essay provide a few examples of, whether the focus should be on broader reforms, such as reforms of social media or political donation reform, or focusing on threats from China itself. So with social media, we know that there are a lot of misinformation and disinformation on a lot of social media platforms. TikTok and WeChat are the two well-known ones that's originally from China. But of course, there's also a lot of disinformation, misinformation on X or Facebook, which are from America. But how they're treated is often a little bit different by the fact that these TikTok and WeChat apps are seen as Chinese apps, because they're apps from China. So when we investigate disinformation or misinformation from there, so it's often categorized as a national security threat or an interference threat. And this only happens when the app is a Chinese app, basically. But with Facebook or X, which are US companies, when we think about the threats from that or the problems with those apps, then the focus is on social cohesion or misinformation, but rarely they're categorized as national security threat. So how they're framed is different, even though they have a lot of similar problems, but how they're framed is quite different, and the response then is also quite different because of that. because TikTok and WeChat, I think, is national security threat. So that's elevated importance. And for example, the options has been floated by a lot of people, including parliamentarians in the past, to ban those apps. And those options were not floated with other social media apps, not from China. So I think that's the securitization is where there's a problem, where if something's from China, it's perceived automatically as a national security threat, when something not from China is not seen automatically the same. There's a lot of problems with social media, not just misinformation, disinformation, but also, for example, online harassment. There are a lot of social problems with that. But how to deal with, I think we need to take a more of a broader approach rather than just dealing with a piecemeal approach where we approach threats from China in a certain way, but then threats from elsewhere in a different way.
Yeah, because as you say, there's certainly been demonstrated problems with a lot of social media platforms, including kind of Facebook and Meta playing roles in undermining democracies, and other social media platforms in enabling genocide in some countries as well. But as you say, it's not necessarily seen as a security threat in the same way that the Chinese apps are, as you were mentioning there, Yun. I'm going to go to questions from the audience very shortly, but Merriden, I did just want to come back to your essay before we go to those questions, and just ask a little bit about I guess that concept that Emma was raising before of deterrence, and how a lot of foreign and security policy seems to have now returned to that Cold War framing of deterrence. How useful is that when it comes to our approach to China?
I was really hoping that you'd come back to that, because when Emma was talking about it, I was trying really hard not to leap into the conversation and completely sideline. Look, deterrence is just accepted now as the way to do things. But if we take a few steps back and ask, why and what is it for? I think it's really, really interesting, because Eli Ratner is a lovely guy. He's the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs in the States. And he just did a keynote address at the Center for Strategic and International Studies earlier in October. And I think reading that, gives you everything that you need to know about the dominant conventional narrative. So Eli Ratner talks about, and this goes back to Emma's point about how this idea of the rules-based order is understood and framed from various perspectives. He says that China is being coercive, increasingly using its military to support revisionist aims, refashion the international order, that is to say, undermine the rules-based order. And this is where I think things get interesting, in ways that would deeply undermine vital US interests and global peace and stability. So everything is framed as, how does this matter to us and our hegemony as America? And all of the responses to China about, is this threatening us and global peace and stability, with an inference that everything that is American interests must be the same as global peace and stability. They're completely synonymized. So what Eli's talking about is, that being said, that's what China's trying to do. How are we going to stop them? And interestingly, in the US and also in Australia, we've moved to deterrence as a means to stop China. 5 years ago, we were still talking about engagement. 10 years ago, we were still talking about how do we work with China? How do we engage China? But now we've completely given up on the idea of engaging. And now, how do we stop? We failed. Engagement failed. And there's actually some interesting essays that came out from high-ranking US thinkers on this idea, and Eli Ratner was one of them. We tried to engage. It didn't work. We were wrong about China. Now we must stop them. And it's interesting, the sort of lack of self-reflection about how come engagement didn't work. Did we do something wrong there? But anyway, here we are. We're all about deterrence. And does deterrence work? If you think about China's worldviews, right, and I sort of referred to them a bit earlier, how it understands itself, how it understands the world. It understands itself as humiliated, persecuted, everyone's ganging up on it, everyone's trying to keep it down, but it knows that in time, it will resume its rightful place in the world. It will get back to where it thinks it's supposed to be. That's how we're seeing the world. Everyone's out to get me. Along comes deterrence. Deterrence says, as Eli points out in his speech, we're going to invest in military expansion. We're going to invest in research development. Our military is going to be more lethal. We're going to be able to control and contain China. And we're going to stop it. We're going to deter it. We're going to deter it from invading Taiwan. We're going to deter it from trying to coerce other nations. We're going to deter it from military expansionism. Now, if you're China, right, and you see the world in the way that I've just described, do you think, yes, right, I'll stop? No, you're right. I was wrong all along. No, sorry about that. I'll stop immediately. Or do you think, oh, look, there is another country, there's the US trying to keep me down and trying to contain me and trying to stop me from achieving the thing that is rightfully mine, just as they have always done. So deterrence, in fact, in China, in the case of China, is just having the effect of creating an arms race. It's having the effect of the proverbial can being kicked down the road. China is not changing its mind. China is not saying, I won't do that thing. It's just saying, I won't do that thing just yet. But in the meantime, I'm going to keep on building my capability to do that thing so that when I do it, I'll win. So it's not, it's a postponement. It doesn't stop anything. It just postpones it until later. So is that successful? Maybe you can say, well, they haven't invaded Taiwan, so we've done really well. Or is that actually just creating a larger problem for later? Now, that's not clear, right? That's not an easy thing to answer, but it's a question that we have to ask. Is this successful? What does successful deterrence actually mean? And is this what we really want to achieve? So it's an open question.
I'm going to go to questions from the audience now, and thank you very much for putting your questions in there. You can upvote other people's questions, which helps me to find the good ones or the ones that people are most interested in. Merriden, I'm going to ask this one to you first up. It's from Ian Smith. He says, I'm interested in the panel's perspectives on why the Chinese government is dismissing the rules of the sea in the South China Sea by occupying and militarizing disputed islands and what their intended outcomes are.
That's a very good question. Why is China dismissing the rules of the sea? Because it doesn't see them as legitimate, I guess, is the simplest answer to that. Emma, you might have some thoughts, but again, this idea of who made these rules and whose interests are these rules being exercised, and is this how we understand history to be? Again, maybe they're not right in that. Maybe they are doing things that impinge on the territorial sovereignty of others, but they just simply don't, I think, generally, they don't see that as being a legitimate system. Emma, do you have some thoughts that you would want to add?
Yeah, look, Merritt, I think you're absolutely right. And I think it goes back to our earlier discussion around the kind of selective application and uptake of those rules and the inconsistency around particularly the United States adherence and support for the conventions, UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, for example. And so I think part of what China is doing is quite deliberately and for quite obvious political reasons, pointing out a level of hypocrisy that exists in the international system. But I think that it's also really important to keep in mind that everything that Merriden and Yun have said about our perceptions of China and what it's doing and why it is doing what it's doing when we're talking about contested areas like the South China Sea, because I think we risk pretty severe miscalculation if we, assume, like many in the United States do, and Australian policymakers take a lot of their cues from what the Americans assume about China. If we assume that this is about China attempting to achieve primacy in the entire region rather than, say, a question of regional security tied to those deep historical understandings of what how the rest of the world perceives China. So I think this very much falls into the categories that we've been talking about around misunderstanding and particularly around deterrence as well, and whether deterrence will be effective when we're approaching China, or whether it will even achieve what we want to achieve. Merriden, there was such a good line in your essay about whatever it is we want to achieve when it comes to Beijing, because that isn't clear either. I don't think it's clear what we or the West is trying to achieve in the South China Sea at all. It's not something that's really discussed. What is our end game here? So again, I think that's why these essays are so important.
Ewan, did you want to add anything to that? Or I've got another question here that I think would be good for you.
And I think, both Emma and Merriden made really excellent points. I think from my personal perspective, the Chinese government believes that South China Sea is an important issue to them, but also they are changing facts on the ground in South China Sea. Well, they're not the only one doing it either. A few other governments are changing facts on the ground, but from their perspective, they see other countries, in the past have acted against international law, including by changing facts on the ground, and despite persistent international condemnations, and that's still happening. I'm sure I can cite many examples. So from the Chinese government's perspective, if it's powerful, I know Merriden did not want to use that word powerful, according to, from their perspective, from my understanding of their perspective, a powerful country, a powerful government can just violate international law at will. And unfortunately, past powerful governments have done that. And so it is following in that example.
Ewan, this next question is from Ian Warfield, and I want to put it to you first. He asks, how does this narrative of Chinese historical viewpoints justify the subjugation, I'm guessing that might be, of ethnic minorities? That's Ian's question. And I just wonder, your essay deals with the subject of how ethnic minorities were treated in Australia in the Senate inquiry process as well. Just thinking about that for your answer as well.
So the Chinese government does not believe it is a colonial power. According to the government's perspective, it has maintained that even though the People's Republic of China only started in 1949, its constant message to the people, both domestically and internationally, is that it is a successor of all the past Chinese empires. But according to the Chinese government, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, for example, are not what you will call indigenous people. They're ethnic minorities, according to the government, but they're not, in a sense, indigenous people like we see indigenous people in Australia. So even though the Chinese government signed up to a few treaties regarding how we should protect, indigenous people and how we should treat them better, it refuses to basically acknowledge them as indigenous people of China, but just another ethnic minorities that live with other, including with ethnic majority Han people in China. So from their perspective, I think they are giving them, some ways preferential treatment. But I think from our perspective and from my personal perspective as well, I don't think that these are enough. In fact, they are committing a lot of atrocities, including culturally, against these ethnic minority people in China. But for a lot of, unfortunately, for a lot of Han majority, so Han people are the majority in China, for a lot of those people, people from the majority ethnic background, they're not really feeling that. In fact, they feel that ethnic minorities are getting preferential treatment because, they get preferential treatment in terms of going to universities, and until quite recently, they can have more than one child, whereas the Han majority couldn't. So there's a lot of conflict, I guess, from ethnic minority and the Han majority regards how they perceive each other being treated. And I think in some way, there's the same, the debate and arguments as also presented in Australia is also a little bit similar, but I think there's probably in Australia we'll have a better understanding of the issue, whereas I feel in China, people are not really understanding of these important issues yet. And of course, one important reason for that is that the government does control the narrative and does control the media.
Thank you. Emma, I wonder if I might come off the back of that to you with a question from Richard Bentley. And he asks, does Australia have a unique opportunity to be an honest broker between East and West here, with educational and trade ties that are mutually beneficial, and to further China's development both economically and socially is in everyone's interests? Can I start with you on that one?
That's a really a lovely question, Richard, and very optimistic, which I think is to be commended. I think absolutely, and this is evident in some of the essays in this issue, we tend to underestimate how much agency Australia could have in our foreign policy, particularly in our foreign policy in the region. And there's some interesting points made about Foreign Minister Penny Wong's approach to foreign policy and a kind of seeking out, I suppose, of regional security. And absolutely, any kind of seeking out of regional security, I think, has to be more than the prevention of conflict. You know, so much of what Merriden has been, Merriden's essay talks about is this kind of Western realist assumption that the best we can aspire to is the kind of avoidance of direct war. And what I've argued, and I think what the essays are kind of pointing to, is that we can actually have a bit more ambition when it comes to our engagement with the region, that we can aim for deeper ties, cultural ties, and Jiang talked about this as well, cultural ties, creative ties, as a way of building up regional solidarity, I suppose, and a way of also, I guess, kind of circuit breaking the way that so much of our conversation is dominated by so-called strategic competition between the United States and China, over which we have very little influence or control. And so I think what a different approach can evolve in terms of Australian foreign policy and Australian engagement is actually much deeper engagement with other partners in Asia who have so much, I think, to teach us about understanding and engaging with the complexities of China that we've been talking about today. And those kind of educational ties, those creative ties, are a really important way to do that. But to kind of step back a little bit, in order to do that effectively, we first probably have a lot of work to do at home, in particular, in the way that we talk about China, that, you know, clearly these essays are addressing directly, and the way that we and our government in particular, as Jiang has outlined, engage with Chinese Australians. And so that approach, that deep approach around education and creative ties is critically important. But in order to be understood as a good faith actor, particularly by China, I think we've got a lot of work to do first and a lot of self-examination to do first. I don't know if Merriden and Jiang think that's fair.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I've noticed a couple of different people have asked about AUKUS in the questions. So Emma, I'm going to come back to you briefly on that. So I've got a couple of different questions asking if AUKUS means we're going to have a more difficult time saying no to the Americans in the event of a conflict with China, and also asking about the idea of why isn't this potential reality of an AUKUS agreement more of an issue in Australian politics. But I'm going to ask you to be brief in your response, Emma, because we don't have a huge amount of time here. I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. Look, I think it's not more of an issue because we have a settled bipartisan consensus around national security, and Margaret Simons outlines this really clearly when, you know, in calling her essay No Daylight, we can see that, especially around AUKUS, there is consensus, and it is going to be really hard to crack. And I would also, in answer to the first question about how closely this ties us to the United States, I'd really recommend James Curran's essay, the opening essay, where he states quite clearly that, you know, while AUKUS has a historical logic to it, it's also going to make it pretty impossible for Australia to say no to the United States in the event of a conflict with China. But I would say that situation is entirely avoidable, and this conversation is so critical to making sure that it stays that way.
Yeah, thank you. Merriden, I thought I might come back to you in case you had any further response on that idea of Australia being an honest broker. I know your essay deals a lot with kind of the gap in understanding of Australia, of China's motives. Is that realistic to think of Australia's role in that way?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I agree absolutely with everything that Emma answered there. And Emma said, you know, we've got a lot of work to do to be seen as good faith actors by China. Yes. And the way that we have to also understand how China sees us. And it's not as important as we like to think we are. So if we think that we're in a position to be influencing or negotiating with China because China cares what we think, we're somewhat misguided about that. But we've also got a lot of work to do with thinking about being an honest broker with other actors in the region as well, because we have not gone about our regional engagement. Penny Wong is doing things in a different way, but actors in the region don't necessarily see us as a good faith actor. There's a lot more to unpack there, but in the interest of time, we're not in a good position to be taken seriously as a neutral actor, as an objective negotiator by anyone in the region.
Yun, I'm going to come back to you because one, I think of the observations of your essay is around that Chinese Australian voices are often missing in our debate around these issues because of some of those issues that we've already spoken about, the kind of being suspect of their motives, being subject to influence. So I wonder if you can just help us wrap up with, I guess, what you see going forward as how we can re-engage Chinese Australian voices in this debate and why they're important to have in the debate.
Yeah. Generally, there's a lot of knowledge, a lot of connections with China amongst Chinese Australian communities. When we look at a few data around language and Asian literacy skills in Australia, generally it is those those kind of skills are concentrated in Chinese Australian communities. So that is why it's important that they do have a voice. But there's often a phenomenon where, if an idea was raised by a national security or foreign policy person, and especially if that person was, a man, then many people will agree with it and go, oh, that's a great idea, and find it very reasonable. But if the exact same idea was raised by a Chinese Australian, especially for women, or even someone who just works on, China, and have a lot of connections with China, either academic or personal, and they then face a lot of opposition to their ideas, even though they have exact same idea. And a lot of people will start to question their intention and motive. I think one thing that we really need to do is to get away from that, the questioning of motive, and really just debate ideas based on their merits instead. I think that's really important in getting more voices heard, a lot more to move the debate on more reasonable grounds. And unfortunately, we have already learned the habits of self-censorship, well, both in China and in Australia, really. And that will take time to unlearn.
Yeah. I'm afraid we are going to have to wrap it up there, but I will just make a note. We've had one of these webinars on Australia's relationship with the United States, where we ended up talking a lot about China. This one's been focused on China. Still a lot of debate around AUKUS and our arrangements with the United States. So I think they'll continue to be inextricably linked for a little while going forward. But I want to thank our panelists, and I want to encourage everyone to go out and grab a copy of the Journal of Australian Foreign Affairs. The issue is out in newsagents and good bookstores all around Australia. It's been a really fantastic discussion. Thank you so much for all the wonderful questions from the audience. I feel like we covered a lot of ground. Unfortunately, we can't get everywhere, and I feel like there was a lot more detailed questions around, for example, Pine Gap and, a lot of other things that perhaps we can get into in future webinars on AUKUS in particular. But thank you so much, Dr. Merriden, Varrall, Dr. Emma Shortis, and Yun Jiang. Please check out Australian Foreign Affairs. It's a really fantastic issue, and I personally learned a lot as a complete non-expert in this area, and very accessible if this is something that you're interested in but haven't really dipped a toe in. I think a really good way to get across a whole bunch of facets of our relationship with China. Thanks everyone for coming along today. As I said, we had more than 700 people registered today, and around 350 with you on the line with us. Make sure that you subscribe to our podcast, Follow the Money, on iTunes or wherever you normally listen to podcasts. And you can check out our next webinar, which is on food waste in Australia, with Ronnie Khan, the CEO and founder of OzHarvest, and Nina Gabor from our Waste and Circular Economy program. That's next week, and you can find the details on our website at australiainstitute.org.au. That's next week. And also check out our upcoming Revenue Summit in Australian Parliament House. That's coming up in Canberra next Friday. That's for everyone who's interested in tax reform and making sure we have adequate revenue to provide the public services that all Australians need and enjoy. Thanks very much for joining us today. That's it from us, and we will see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.